في ال question and answer, Benjamin from Le Monde أعتقد is
بلش. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mohammed Al-Masri. I welcome everybody who's attending this second session to announce the results and the main findings of the Arab Opinion Index of 2019-2020 with me, Dr. Dana Al-Kurd. Dr. Dana Al-Kurd is a researcher at the Arab Center, and she is as well researcher at the Arab Opinion Index. She is working with the team in designing the survey, supervising, conducting the survey, and writing and publishing the results of the surveys. We just finished, the Arabic session with some journalists and academics from the Arab world, and we will have, some now journalists and academics who are speaking in English. Dr. Dana is going to talk for 25 minutes, and then I will take, the questions from you. I'll pass it to Dr. Dana. And if any one of you is having a question, can raise a hand as it goes after her presentation. Dr. Dana, it's yours now.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. All right, everybody can see it, hopefully. Okay. So, yes, thank you for that introduction, Dr. Muhammad. Today I'll be giving a look at the 2019-2020 Arab Opinion Index survey results, which is the largest project on Arab public opinion in the region. And just to give you kind of a quick roadmap of what I'm going to cover in this presentation. First, I'm just going to give an intro to the Arab Opinion Index and its sections. I'm going to take some selections of the data just to kind of demonstrate the types of data that we have in the index. And then I'll use 3 examples to demonstrate kind of the utility of the various forms of data that we use. Focusing on the examples of Arab public opinion towards the US and American foreign policy, Arab public opinion on Israel and Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and as well as gauging public opinion under authoritarian context and how the Arab Opinion Index can be useful in that regard. And then at the end, I'll just cover how to access the Arab Opinion Index data and any of the analysis, as well as the full report. So as I mentioned, the Arab Opinion Index is the largest Arab public opinion survey coming out of the Arab world, and it's housed here at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. We develop our battery of questions relevant to our context and region through kind of an iterative process of pilot surveys, focus groups, and in-depth interviews. And we're informed, obviously, by other relevant surveys that do work in the region, and we take their conceptual decisions into account, but we don't translate any of our survey questions verbatim or anything, and we try to make sure that it's very contextualized to our context and our region. And we have a firm belief that Arab public opinion matters. When countries like the US rely on kind of regime rhetoric or discourse or the opinions of political elite, they won't be able to construct effective long-term policies, and they'll get kind of a skewed sense of Arab public opinion and where it stands. So in terms of sampling, just to kind of give you an overview of our method, we follow a randomized stratified multi-stage self-weighted clustered approach, and it gives us an overall margin of error between 2 and 3% depending on the individual country in question. And we guarantee probability proportional to size. So basically, sampling is where you take subgroups from kind of a target population and you generalize from those subgroups. So probability proportional to size kind of takes into account the varying sample sizes, and it helps to avoid underrepresenting any particular group in the study. and it ensures kind of fairness in the various population segments. So this year's survey wave was conducted in 13 countries, oftentimes in conjunction with local partners, and we had over 28,000 respondents. And the 13 countries were Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Mauritania. And the overall team was 900 individuals. We tried to make sure that it's equally balanced on gender to not skew the results in any way. And we conducted over 69,000 hours of face-to-face interviews. Qatar and Saudi Arabia were conducted over the phone, given certain conditions, and the rest were face-to-face. So now I'm just going to give kind of like I said, a brief overview of the sections and the data that's included in each section. This is just a sample, but the full report will be available online after the press conference in both Arabic and in English. So you can kind of see every question that we ask. The first question kind of asks about the living conditions of Arab citizens. We look into like economic conditions, social services, all of these kinds of things. So this question, for example, the one I have here on the screen is, how would you describe the general economic situation in your country? And it's broken down by the country itself. And as to be expected, the Gulf countries have the most positive assessment of living conditions, and in other areas it gets quite worse. But it makes a lot of sense given the situation. And we also ask questions on immigration. And we actually also break this down a lot more, whether or not they wish to immigrate, but also, where and for what reason. For example, like pursuing education, political security, all these things. We also have it broken down by gender, age, and other demographic factors. And that kind of rich data can be very useful to kind of dig into the data beyond just descriptive statistics. We can do regression analysis and things like this. So, for example, again, understandably, here in this particular graph, we see that there's less of a desire to immigrate in Gulf countries than other places. Again, that makes sense with the living conditions. Now, section 2 deals with perceptions of state institutions, as well as state capacity, trust in different parts of the government. So we ask them, like, how well do you trust the military? How well do you trust the parliament? All of these kinds of different aspects of the state. And this question here is on trust in the military specifically, which enjoys a high rate of trust across the Arab world. There is, of course, some level of preference falsification in particularly repressive states, but overall militaries are seen as institutions of competence and trust. And I'll discuss more in the coming slides how we try to get around this kind of issue of preference falsification in some of these countries. And this is the same question over time, over the different waves of the Arab Opinion Index. So we see that trust in the army or trust in the military is not changed very much over time since we've started. In comparison, political parties, which is the graph that you see here, and trust in political parties is quite negative, and it kind of speaks volumes about the state of politics in the Arab world, I think, and legitimacy of current political actors. So, a lot of red in this graph versus a lot of blue in the other one. And then the third section, we ask about attitudes towards democracy. So we ask them about, levels of democracy in their country directly, as well as different components of democracy, and how respondents, define democracy, how they perceive it, all of these kinds of nitty-gritty issues that can help us get an accurate assessment of where our public opinion is on this issue. So, for example, we give them a number of statements, and we ask them to agree or disagree with these statements. We find that a majority of respondents disagree with the set of statements which characterize democracy negatively. And this is not a large majority, but it's still, more people disagree with negative assessments of democracy than positive assessments. And when we ask specifically about the statement that, my society is unprepared for democracy, how well they agree or disagree with that, these are the results broken down by country, and it shows, variation on this question. We see that even in countries which don't have representative government, you see a disagreement with the idea that their society is unprepared for democracy. So, for example, in a place like Saudi Arabia, response rates are understandably high, given the sensitivity of the question. But you see more agreement with the idea that there's a particular society is unsuited to democracy or not ready for democracy in countries that have kind of active conflict over democratic institutions as we speak. So, for example, like Iraq at the top of the chart. And we also have respondents, like I said, assess levels of democracy in their country, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest every year. So we kind of have a gauge of public perception of that issue. And we also have this data broken down by country. These are the averages across the Arab world in each wave of the Arab Opinion Index. So you see a slight improvement on this front since 2011. But again, there's a large degree of preference falsification in some of these more repressive states. And I'll demonstrate how we try to resolve this issue with kind of response bias. So this is the same question that I just showed you earlier, broken down by country. The level of democracy in each country. You can see what I mean here. Saudi Arabia has a high level of democracy, quote unquote, for instance, when, we all know that's clearly not the case. And there's an element here of respondents expressing what they think others want to hear, so kind of a social desirability bias. And there's a huge disjuncture between this question, level of democracy, and a question that we ask about their ability to criticize the government. So 1 being the least ability, which is in red, and 10 being the most ability to criticize the government. So in places like, again, Saudi Arabia, where they say, we have a high level of democracy, they answer in that form. When you ask them with more detail, ability to criticize the government is very, very low. So it's clearly that there's some sort of social desirability bias happening with how people are responding. And finally, in this last example from this section, we compare definitions of democracy across the Arab world based on kind of the most prevalent responses to an open-ended question. And we find that, our Arab respondents have a pretty clear understanding of what democracy means. The majority say it's a preservation of civil and public liberties, equality and justice for all citizens. Very few kind of tie it to religion or promoting positive, kind of vague notions of promoting positive values, or even improving the economic situation is much lower on this list. And in the 4th section of the Arab Opinion Index, we can also kind of gauge civic and political participation, and in many ways also gauge political apathy, because we ask these questions every year and we can kind of make these comparisons. So this is a question that asks how interested are you in the political conditions of your country? And we can see, political apathy, a little interested or not at all interested is kind of a significant chunk of the data. And we also have questions on how they participate, how respondents participate in what kinds of organizations and how much they participate. So this question looks at respondent engagement with different kinds of civil society organizations. And as you can see, participation overall is quite low. And again, that's understandable given the conditions of the region. And finally, in this section, we have an assessment of media and media consumption, and how they utilize different social media, where they get their news, all these things. This might be very useful, particularly for people who work on media issues. So for this question, for example, we ask them, where do you get your news? TV channels, radio, daily newspapers, the internet, friends and friends and family, and word of mouth. And you can kind of see the breakdown on these. The 5th section deals with religion in politics. So, excuse me, 1 second. So we have questions on how people define religiosity, whether they would define themselves as religious, and the role religion should play in politics. And this question here shows kind of self-identified religiosity. So there's a great deal of self-identified religiosity, religious to some extent, or very religious. And in terms of gauging, the role of religion in politics, we asked them in this question that you see here if they agreed or disagreed with the idea that it would be better for their home country if religion was separated from politics. And we can see there's a bit of polarization on this issue, but a majority agree that religion should be separated from politics. Finally, in the 6th section, we asked about kind of inter-Arab relations, like, for example, whether or not they view the Arab world as a single nation. And here we see in this chart here that over time, a sizable majority has identified with the idea that Arab peoples constitute kind of a single nation. And a total of 81% of the respondents to the 2019-2020 Arab Opinion Index supported the sentiment that various Arab peoples formed a single nation, in contrast to only 16% who agreed with the idea that the Arab peoples are distinct nations with only tenuous bonds. And it's interesting in places where we see, you know, like I said, kind of unresolved conflict, such as in Lebanon and Iraq, is where we see the highest support for the idea that the Arab peoples are tied together by tenuous bonds, or not so much a cohesive nation. But again, even then, it's a very low number of respondents. We also have assessments in this section of foreign policy. So for example, we asked them to gauge how positive or negative different countries are in terms of their foreign policies towards the region and towards their own countries in different questions. And here we see, for example, assessments of Iran and Iranian policy, and which is generally seen as negative across a variety of foreign policy issues such as Palestine, Syria, or Yemen. And these kinds of questions kind of allow us to compare across different countries. So for example, here we see that Turkey is viewed much more positively compared to Iran in terms of foreign policy. And I'm going to break down a little bit more of American foreign policy in the coming slides as well. And in the final section, we have on ISIS and terrorism-related questions, but I think I'll probably get to those only if we have the time. So I've given you kind of a taste of the data, and I'm going to now delve into the 3 examples, starting with Arab opinion of US policy. And generally speaking, it would be quite negative compared to other countries that are asked about. So for example, when asked to identify the country that poses the most threat to the region and to the respondent's country, Israel and the United States are the 2 main threats that people bring up. Iran comes in at 3rd place, and Turkey is seen much more favorably and is much lower on the list. And in terms of assessing foreign policy generally of these different countries, again, the US and Israel are the most negatively perceived compared to other nations that we ask about. Turkish, Chinese, German, all the different types of international intervention we try to ask about, and this is pretty consistent across the waves. When we ask to look at specific, U.S. foreign policy areas, the vast majority of respondents had negative views of U.S. policy towards Palestine, 81%, and Syria, 77%. And what's clear from this data and some of the other questions that we included in our survey is that Arabs have a negative view of American foreign policy as a policy, not that they're being, plainly anti-American, because we also have questions that ask about how much they like the American people and things like this, and the results are very different. And the second example of how we can use our data effectively is the section on Arab opinion towards the Palestinian cause, particularly to inform the recent debates around normalization. This is especially the case because social media has been somewhat hijacked by authoritarian regimes. A recent study by Andrew Lieber and Alexei Abrahams in the International Journal of Communication shows how a few government-affiliated influencers are driving the conversation around these areas on social media. So getting a sense of public opinion really expands the scope of our understanding and also changes, what we think about the implications of such a policy as normalization. So, for example, when we ask about whether or not they support or oppose normalization with the State of Israel, the highest rate of support, which is still not high at 13%, is in countries that, 1, already have a normalization deal with Israel, such as Egypt, or 2, are currently being heavily pressured to pursue normalization with Israel, such as Sudan. And again, it's at 13%, it's not even that high. Algeria has a 99% disapproval rating. And what's very interesting here is in Saudi Arabia, because of issues of repression, and people kind of get the sense that the government is exploring the idea of normalization, or is in the process of quietly changing their position to some extent, and people feel that they can't go against government policy given the current climate, but they also don't support government policy. So what we see is we have a high rate of refusal in a country like Saudi Arabia. We have 29% refusal rate on this question. And in spite of that, we still have 65%, so still a majority of Saudis who were polled on this question oppose the idea of normalization. And when asked to elaborate on the reasons for the disapproval in an open-ended question, the majority that opposed diplomatic ties between their countries and Israel highlighted factors such as Israeli racism towards the Palestinians and its expansionist policies. A minority of respondents also named Israeli racism towards Arabs in general and its role in regional instability as a reason for their opposition. And among the minority, the very small minority who did accept the idea or did not oppose the idea of recognition of Israel by their governments, the reasons were also quite nuanced. In a similar open-ended question, half of this minority made such recognition conditional on the formation of an independent Palestinian state. So from these open-ended, justifications given by those who did and did not support recognition, we find that political reasons are the most salient for both groups. It's very little commentary on kind of the religious aspect, the religious aspect that's sometimes used by certain political actors. This is not really the case for Arab public opinion. They don't really view this conflict in that sense. And our data shows that Arab opposition to Israel and recognition of Israel is strongly linked to support for the Palestinian cause. So more than 3/4 of the respondents in the latest survey agree that the Palestinian cause concerns all Arabs and not just the Palestinians alone. We see a decline in this number after particularly the conflicts that took root after the Arab Spring. So from 84 to 77 in 2013, 2014. But we also see a modest increase from 75 to 79% since the start of the Trump administration. And in future analysis, we can kind of dig into these country-specific trends as well. So this is the country-specific trends just for 2019-2020. What we see is that the Palestinians themselves, even though, again, a majority believe that it's a cause for all Arabs, they're the ones who have the highest rate of agreement with the idea that this cause is for Palestinians alone, at 29%. But in all countries, it's a decisive majority for Palestinian cause being the cause of all Arabs, and the highest in Algeria, Jordan, and Qatar. And finally, the third example I wanted to mention is how we can use this data to gauge public opinion in authoritarian context, and how we are trying to get around the challenges of conducting surveys in this context. So Arab regimes are authoritarian. Many of them are very authoritarian for a variety of historical and structural reasons. And because of this, there's a disconnect between regime policy and public opinion in a lot of these countries that's often not picked up by surveys unless you try to, very directly address this problem. And we try to do that. So I'm going to give an example from the 2017-2018 survey wave, where the direct question on Israeli normalization at that time had a high rate of non-response. Again, I think it was like, so 29% this year, in 2019-2020, 29% said they refused to answer this question about normalization. And in the 2017-2018 survey, we asked the same question and we got a 36% non-response rate. So, because of the recent repressive crackdown on civil society in Saudi Arabia and kind of the shifts in rhetoric, it's difficult now to pose questions around Palestine and get an accurate assessment. And there's this high non-response rate that we have to get around. So what we did is we used a list experiment to gauge more accurately Saudi Arabian public opinion on the issue. List experiments are often used in survey research to kind of elicit true feelings regarding sensitive issues. So for example, what usually happens is, and this is what we did in this example, is that respondents are asked to list the number of, they're given a number of items in a survey question, and they're asked to give how many are important to them. They're not asked to identify which ones, they're just asked to give a number of how many of these items are important to them. So 1/2 of the sample is randomly assigned to getting 4 items. And then the second half of the sample is randomly assigned to getting 5 items. And that 5th item is the sensitive item, quote unquote, which was the Palestinian cause. So if there's a statistically significant difference between the number of items chosen between the 2 halves of the sample, then we can tell that the inclusion of the 5th item, the Palestinian cause in this case, is the reason for this difference, without putting anybody in kind of any kind of sensitive situation, because they're not identifying what exactly is important to them. They're just identifying the amount or the number. So what we found when we ran this experiment, is that there's indeed a highly statistically significant difference between the 2 halves of the sample. For those who received the 4-item question, their average number of items chosen was 2.079. And the average number of items for those chosen in the 5-item question was 2.815. And again, this is highly statistically significant at the highest level, p-value less than 0.01%. It gives us reason to believe that the Palestinian cause remains important to the Saudi sample, but that the fear of responding truthfully explains the lack of response as well as the high attrition rate. Because if it wasn't important to them, adding that fifth item wouldn't have made a statistically significant difference between the two halves of the sample. So that's just one way that we try to get around kind of engaging in surveys in these kinds of difficult environments. And finally, it's very useful at engaging Arab respondents, engaging public opinion on current events. So for example, we, with the recent waves of protests in Iraq, Algeria, Sudan, and Lebanon, we asked them direct questions about how much they support or oppose these protest movements, their participation rates, and this is very, valuable data going forward on studying these incidents and these events. So the majority in most of these countries supported these protests by an overwhelming degree. So in Sudan, Iraq, Algeria, and Lebanon, the majority that were polled supported the protests. But actual participation is not as high. But this is the case, for all protest movements, generally speaking, and throughout history, it's often a low participation rate. But in Sudan, it's the highest participation rate, with 37% stating that they had participated in protests, and the lowest in Iraq with 15%. So some conclusions. The Arab Opinion Index's comparative advantage is to create measures that capture kind of underlying persistent problems in the Arab world using highly contextualized knowledge of our cases. And we have yearly measures of a variety of variables as well as current events. So we can kind of trace these variables over time and make more accurate assessments in our analysis. And we utilize, like I said, an in-depth knowledge of cases, rigorous testing of question wording, and experimental analysis, as I showed in the Saudi Arabian example, to arrive at the most accurate assessment of public opinion despite the authoritarian context. And in terms of resources that are available, reports will be made available in English and in Arabic on our website, both the full report and the in-brief report. The Arab Opinion Index also releases analysis of relevant issues depending on the current events of the time, with every issue of CSF Arabiya, which is in Arabic, and in Muntaqa, which is in English, both of which are available open access. You just have to Google them. And finally, the online portal where you're able to interact with the data and explore the data more will be available online soon as well. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go over my time, and I'm open to your questions and feedback.
Dr. Dana, thank you very much for this excellent presentation, and thank you very much for keeping, for maintaining the time that you were given. I was in the first session and I couldn't realize, like 1 hour after the session started that I still have 3 or 4 sections to cover, and I couldn't cover all of them. There are some questions are coming from the social media, and I want to ask. One question is saying, when we are looking at the evaluation of the regional and the regional powers and the international powers, we realize that the Arabs are reviewing or evaluating all of the regional and the international powers negatively towards Palestine, Syria, Libya, and Yemen. What does that mean? That means that is the issue related, how the people are, the perception of the Arabs towards the other regions, or is it due to actual evaluation of the policies of these powers? The other question concerning, the normalization, does it mean that despite the fact that the majority, as it is represented in your survey, are against normalizing with Israel, however, a lot of officials are saying the other way around, and the social media is an example that where people are expressing views in favor of the peace treaties were signed recently. Please.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, so let me answer the first question in terms of evaluation of regional powers, international powers, and being overwhelmingly negative towards particularly Palestine, Syria, Iraq, etc. I think that this kind of captures a general sentiment in the Arab world that international involvement has been quite negative, that international involvement has never been at the behest of the Arab people. It's never been for the sake of resolving conflict. I think that that's kind of a general sentiment, and we see that coming out in the survey. But there are variations. There are clear variations in how people gauge German foreign policy versus American foreign policy. There's clear variations. There's still kind of, it's clearly not like a blanket, negative view of international forces generally. It's quite nuanced, and people recognize, for example, like they don't like American foreign policy towards Palestine. They don't like French policy in Libya. They have very clear, nuanced explanations for this and an understanding of these issues. In terms of normalization, so I guess the question is, my presentation of these survey results shows that public opinion is at odds with what is kind of seen as public sentiment on social media. As I mentioned in the survey, as I mentioned in the presentation, there's recent, very cutting edge recent research that does network analysis and demonstrates how social media is not an accurate assessment of public opinion in the Arab world. One, because, for example, on Twitter usage varies widely in the Arab world. It's very high in the Gulf states. It's very low in other parts of the region. More on top of that, there's criminalization of speech, and there is a targeting of dissidents. In the Emirati case, for example, after the normalization deal, there were official accounts and people affiliated with official institutions who went out and said anybody who speaks out against the normalization deal will be prosecuted. And they even encouraged people to report these incidents and report dissent. So in this environment, when kind of social media and the online spaces are being weaponized by authoritarian regimes, it makes perfect sense that what you're getting is a selection bias. What you're getting is you're only hearing very loudly from people who are either affiliated with the official line, affiliated with official institutions or the government, or people who express these opinions. They might be a minority in their society, but they're the only ones who have the freedom to express their opinions. Whereas people who might have some dissenting opinions don't talk. Because we've seen, incidents of repression. For example, an Emirati novelist spoke out against the normalization deal, and now she's been banned from travel. So these are just some examples. And the Emirat is not the only case, of course. We've seen a lot of repression based on online activity in Egypt as well. But the idea is this is why you're seeing a disconnect between the kind of data we've shown you today and what you might hear in official discourse.
Is there any question from the people who are participating with us on Zoom? You can raise hand.
There's one.
Who? I can't see everybody.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I just would like to understand why it has been possible for the center to conduct a survey within Saudi, people, and not for Emirati and Bahraini. Was there more obstacle, or was it a deliberate decision on your part?
Can I have, because there is Karim Tarabilsi. Thank you, Benjamin. Karim Tarabilsi, you can unmute yourself and ask. Hello?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Hi, Dana. Hi, everyone. So I wanted to ask a question about normalization again, because I think that is currently one of the key issues that is on the Western radar. And it's important to highlight that gulf between public attitudes and government attitudes. But today, for example, in Sudan, there's a report that they might consider a referendum of the Sudanese people. And from our survey of Sudanese writers and journalists who are maybe concentrated in Khartoum or in the diaspora, it actually seems there is some support among the elites for normalization, but in the name of sort of economic pragmatism. So I wonder whether the question about the attitudes in a country like Sudan, but elsewhere, could have taken account that sort of balancing. That if we frame normalization as something that we're going to get something in return for that, would that affect attitudes, and therefore should that have been reflected in questions, for example? That is my question.
Should I answer?
Would you like to answer, please?
Okay, yes. So let me start with Benjamin's question regarding why Saudi, not Bahrain and Emirates, and I think Dr. Muhammad can also add to this answer if I'm insufficient. So like I mentioned, Saudi Arabia was a phone survey because of, we don't want to put people at risk on the ground or anything like this. And we worked with a third party to conduct this phone survey. That third party makes its own calculation regarding risks and regarding access to particular countries. So right now we're able, for the last 2 waves we've been able to do Saudi. This wave we've also been able to add Qatar. Perhaps in the future we can add more, but it kind of depends, I think, on some of these security calculations. As for
can I add something, Dana, and then I'll give to you. To be honest with you, Benjamin, we tried, we had a pilot in United Arab Emirates, and it wasn't successful. We had like a pilot, the number of the phone calls that we made for the pilot, that is having only 9 questions, was more than 5,000 phone calls. And we failed to fill except 15 questionnaire. It was very costly, even throughout, our contract with the third partner. And then we felt that it's unethical, especially in United Arab Emirates, to do the phone survey in United Arab Emirates, because we thought, we don't know to which extent that the government there is able, to monitor the phone calls. We thought that, we might put the people at risk. The same thing, could be applied, to Saudi Arabia. However, I think even, the authoritarian approach of Saudi Arabia, this is my own analysis, is different to the measures that is used in United Arab Emirates now, because maybe the population is bigger, maybe the authoritarian approach in Saudi Arabia is targeting nowadays the elite, the intellectuals, the business community, etc., which is completely, I think, in United Arab Emirates is targeting the people at large, and even the people who are in the Arab region and they travel to United Arab Emirates, as the case happened with this PhD student from Durham University, and with the Jordanian journalist who went to Dubai, and he was tried for a post in his Facebook account. So that was mainly the reason. I hope that we will be able to do it one day in United Arab Emirates. Let me add another thing here. Except the last 2 waves in Saudi Arabia that were done over the phone, our previous surveys was done face-to-face interviews. and that would give us the ability as well, to compare the results between the phone surveys and the face-to-face survey, which give us a confidence in understanding the figures and analyzing the figures. We don't have this base in United Arab Emirates, in the Emirates. I hope that the first thing that I hope that next year and the year after, that we will be able to continue doing surveys in Saudi Arabia, that we wouldn't reach the point that it would be very costly and exhausting making phone calls, a huge number of phone calls in order to survey the targeted sample. That's one thing. And the second thing, I hope that, we will be able, to add other countries, not the Gulf country, it's important, to add Gulf countries like Bahrain, Oman, but as well other Arab countries. I hope, Libya, Yemen will be in the second wave, taken into consideration that until 2015, until 2016, until 2015, that we were doing, Yemen, and until 2014 we were doing Libya. Sorry, Dana, I turn it to you. Thank you.
No problem. I just wanted to respond also to Karim's question regarding framing the question. So the idea that there's some agreement amongst particular elites. Again, that doesn't reflect, I would say, public opinion. Now, in survey analysis, what you do is you have to ask the question kind of directly, without framing. Now, it's an option in the future. We might include a survey experiment of a priming component, so that you prime people for certain types of cues. So, like, for example, getting something in return for normalization, things like that. You could do that, but you have to do it in a way that's systematic. You can't blanket statement, give the entire sample the same cue, because that would also be kind of a biased assessment of the question. You have to kind of do it in an experimental sense of randomly assigning the sample. So, I mean, we've done that in the past. We've done some priming experiments in the past for other questions. We could do so in the future. But the idea for this question was just to ask without priming, without gauging any context, if they support or don't support. And then we ask why. We have open-ended questions about why they support or they don't support. So in the Sudanese example, for instance, I haven't, this data is new and fresh, and I haven't delved into it, but it might be, useful to do some analysis of how the yeses and nos, or support or opposition of this policy, breaks down on education level, breaks down on income, and then the specific explanations given for people who support or oppose. And that would be a good way to kind of gauge what you're talking about. If there's kind of a disconnect, not only between regimes and society, but also within different aspects or different segments of society, which, obviously would be very understandable, especially because in certain countries, the elite are, very, very unrepresentative and very much a minority. I don't know if that answers sorry. I was just saying, I don't know if it answers your question fully, but feel free to ask any follow-ups.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, am I speaking?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. It does answer
the fact that I'm the chair that you talk over.
I thought I needed somebody's permission to speak. Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I think it does matter, because I think ultimately what's going to happen in Sudan is that the regime that really wants normalization, or factions within the regime want normalization, will frame it like that to their population, and that way they might bribe the population to support normalization. So I think that's the only way they're going to be able to sell it, because they will need some democratic legitimacy, I think, for that move. That seems to be the main problem. So I guess it's important to make that point in our coverage of Sudan based on your data. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Actually, Dana, there is a question, I think, I got it from now the social media, I think maybe related to Karim's question, is asking Omar and Nasser, is it ethical to ask the respondents questions about normalization and their economic situation from a methodological point of view, regardless, the politics? Is it ethical?
Yeah. So
I
I would say there's a little bit of a disjunction in the question itself. If we're
then I'll give you another question related to this issue as well. There is another question. Does it mean, talking about the figures of the normalization, does it mean that what it's called by the American administration a historical treaty or a historical deal, does it mean that it will bring disorder to the region, taking into consideration that the overwhelming majority of the people are against such a deal?
Okay. Can I answer the two questions? Okay. So for the first one regarding the ethics of asking the question versus methodologically if it's suitable, those are two separate things. If we talk methodologically, we do it appropriately. We ask the question in a way that doesn't prime people for particular positions. We try to methodologically get the most accurate assessment of people's preferences. But of course, survey questions are imperfect, but we attempt to get as close as possible. In terms of ethically, now, obviously, survey questions that are sensitive can be, distressing, but the respondent has every right to refuse to answer. The respondent has every right to refuse to say I don't know, or to leave the survey at any time. This is very much the way that a lot of polling exists around the world, where you explain at the beginning, you give a briefing to the respondents about the circumstances of the survey, what they're going to be asked, whether or not they want to engage. They have full information before they enter into the survey. At any point in the survey, they're allowed to leave the survey. There's training involved with all the enumerators about not creating kind of an acquiescence bias or anything like that, so that the respondents want to please the enumerator in any way. So, it's all of this is kind of embedded in how we do the training and how we conduct the survey, where we try to, as much as possible, not put anybody at risk or not make anybody uncomfortable. Any questions we're getting, it's freely given. That's why I was trying to stress the non-response rate, because even the non-response is a type of response, and it can tell us something about what the data looks like. But those particular respondents didn't feel comfortable, and they weren't forced or compelled to answer a question. So I think we try to be as ethical as possible. Second to that, we also pursue the appropriate methodologies of asking about income and asking about all of these different demographic factors that are very common in surveys. The second question about normalization, how the Trump administration is saying it's a historic deal, and will this cause disorder in the region? Now, I fully understand, especially given the huge amount of instability in certain countries, certain key countries like Iraq and things like this, and the local issues that they're having to deal with within their own countries, that I'm not suggesting that Palestine is like at the forefront of anyone's mind. But if we look at the Egyptian case prior to 2011, Egyptian pro-Palestinian groups were at the helm of facilitating the groups that went on to lead the Arab Spring. They were at the helm at facilitating skill sharing between activists. And when the Arab Spring happened, there was a great deal of focus on the fact, first during the Intifada protests of the 2000s, and then second during the 2011, there was a great deal of focus on the fact that regime foreign policy towards Palestine was antithetical to what the public wanted. So I'm not saying that it's a major driver of disorder, but it is a factor in disorder. So for example, in Bahrain, we saw the announcement of the normalization deal. Prior to the announcement of the normalization deal, the government had changed the civil bylaws to make it so that it became illegal to have position a foreign policy position that contradicts the official government's foreign policy position. The idea with that is that anybody that is employed by the state or employed by certain arms of the vast arms and institutions that are attached to the state can no longer speak up about it. And in spite of this fact, when normalization was announced, Bahrain went out and protested, and we saw protests in a number of areas. Bahraini civil society spoke out very fiercely. This kind of outcry and disorder that exists when normalization happens creates tensions between states and societies. They create tensions between these regimes and their publics. And I'm not saying we're going to see it tomorrow. I'm not saying that there's going to be protest movements or the fall of regimes because of the Palestinian case, but I'm saying it is a factor.
Khalil, do you want to ask anything? Sorry.
Yes, a couple of questions real quickly. Dana, you mentioned Trump in your description of Arab public opinion vis-a-vis U.S. foreign policy. Is there a significant change in the years prior to Trump versus Trump's? I mean, is that detectable in a significant way?
Should I answer?
Yes, please.
Yes. Sorry, I thought there was another question. So what we see is, I think if I'm recalling the numbers correctly, but I'll get you the exact numbers after this. I think it's a change from 79 to 75% from the beginning of the Trump administration until now. That does not seem like a statistically significant difference, but it is. It doesn't seem like for me and you, like, oh, what's the difference between 79 and 75? But it is quite a shift, statistically speaking. So yeah, that is detectable in the data. And then if you break down further, like I'm sure particular countries are going to be more anti-Trump than others, particular segments of the population. I still have to kind of delve into this data analysis to get the full breakdown.
Your second question.
Yeah, the second one pertains to, again, a trend in Arab support for the Palestinian cause. Generally speaking, as you know, many experts on the region, so-called experts on the region, keep mentioning these days the deterioration in Arab support for Palestine, that Palestine is no longer the core issue for most Arabs. Is this reflected in our data between 2011? I mean, it's almost a decade now, 2011 to 2020. Yeah,
so what we see is that particularly at the beginning of the Arab Spring and at the heyday of the Arab Spring, 2011 to let's say 2013, we see a high degree of support for the Palestinian cause being a cause of all Arabs, and the agreement with the sentiment that the Palestinian cause is a cause for all Arabs at 84%. Now, when you see the conflicts hit, when you see the Syrian civil war start, when you see the counter-revolution in Egypt, all of these different kind of regional instabilities that took root in a number of different countries, you do see a decline in the support for this sentiment that the Palestinian cause is a cause for all Arabs. It remains a vast majority that supports the Palestinian cause at 77% at that point in 2014. But you do see a decline. You do see a significant shift, and it's understandable given that all of a sudden, these countries were falling apart and people are having to deal with their immediate concerns and maybe answered that the Palestinian cause is no longer at the forefront of their minds. But from 2014, from that time period of instability, at the beginning of the instability, till today, we see a small but significant increase to 79%. But again, it's always hovering between 75, 85%. That's a huge margin of Arab public opinion that supports the Palestinian cause.
Do you mind, Dr. Dana, if I add something, to explain this point? I think, it would be a good idea sometimes to analyze the open-ended questions, which the answers that, that the respondents gave on the open-ended questions concerning why you are refusing to normalize with Israel. We don't see a shift among those who are supported, who are in favor of normalizing with Israel or recognizing, diplomatic relations with Israel. Still, 50% of those who are in favor they say it's conditional if there is a viable Palestinian state. I would say that this shift, this would constitute a serious shift if we start, to have new reasons why they are accepting the recognition of Israel. For example, now in the Arab region, throughout the discussion, there are many who are, referring to religious texts saying that we have to have a peace treaty with Israel. Now, if this increases, I would assume this would constitute a serious shift concerning the normalization with Israel and breaking up with supporting the Palestinian cause. I mean, as Dr. Dana, it needs, to be studied and to be analyzed. Further analysis needs to be given to this point, which I don't know if you had answered the question about is this going to bring, you answered it. Yeah, thank you.
I think we're nearing the end of time, I think.
Sorry?
I think we're nearing the end of the time period.
Yeah. And actually, I still, there is another question is again about the perception or the evaluation of the American foreign policy in the region. What's the point? I mean, what's the point? What's the point? I mean, there will be no change in the American on the Arab perception towards United States, especially that United States is not going to change its foreign policy towards Israel. So, I mean, this is the question.
So the question is, why do we
have another? Sorry.
So the question is, why do we ask about American foreign policy?
No. I mean that this trend is going to continue, if you agree or not.
I see.
Especially that they are not going to change their. And there is a question from Florence Dixon. Can you please talk, Dixon?
Hi, sorry, I was just unmuting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. I was just wondering if there's still time, if there's been any statistically significant change in attitudes to Turkish foreign policy over the past years, and if that differs significantly between countries. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Let me start with the second question, Florence Dixon. I don't want to misspeak because I don't know the details of which countries and which years, but I can certainly look into that. And if you want to write me an email or something, I can send you that data in more detail. But I don't actually, I know, for example, just off the top of my head, that Turkish foreign policies rated more positively over the years and Iranian policy more on the decline, for example. But I don't know which countries and I don't know which segments of the population, so I would have to look into that. But in terms of the first question, the trend for American foreign policy, is it unchanging? Will it ever change? I mean, so I guess the point is what's the point of, thinking about an Arab perception of American foreign policy? There are shifts between administrations. And I think that there's a growing understanding amongst American policymakers that they need to kind of reassess their Middle East policy. Now, I'm not sure if they're reassessing it in the right direction, but there is an understanding that they need to reassess their foreign policy, especially with regards to attitudes towards Israel. I mean, when you look at, I'm not an Americanist. I don't specialize in American politics, but just when you look at polls related to people's perception of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are shifts. There are significant shifts towards that. And these are the people that will become party leaders. They will become, decision makers in the Democratic Party, particularly moving forward. So we saw in the latest incident with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, backing out of an event that memorialized Rabin. So that's one example that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. And I think that there's going to be kind of this shift towards particularly American policy towards Israel. And I'm not saying drastic shifts. I'm not, so naive as to assume that they're going to become pro-Palestinian. But, I don't think that it's accurate to say that it's been unchanging. There are shifts at the margins, and it's always important to understand the perceptions of people who are at the brunt and at the bearing the brunt of these kinds of policies, what they think.
Thank you very much, Dana. We are almost done, but I mean, concerning to Dixon's question, I had the chance while you were answering the second question to look at the Arab Index in brief, which is discussing this issue. There is a bit of deterioration in the evaluation of the Turkish foreign policy in the region. And it can be seen even concerning the Palestinian question or the Palestinian problem. The ones who evaluated the the Arabs evaluated the Turkish policy towards the Palestinian question 5 years ago was more positive than it is evaluated nowadays. The same thing can be said about the Syrian issue. Yeah, there are some specific countries. I mean, I don't have all of the figures of all of the countries in front of me, but for example, there is a shift in the attitude in Egypt. Even something like 8% of the Egyptian people believes that Turkey is constituting a threat to the national security of Egypt. So there is a differentiation between country to another, and a differentiation. Actually, to add to this, even for example, in Tunisia, they are not evaluating positively Turkish policy towards Libya, while the percentage of the people who declined concerning it is policy in Syria is more in Tunisia than when it comes to the question of its policy in Libya. To be honest, because I have now the figures in front of me. To be honest, it varies from one country to another. For example, the Algerian public opinion reviews France more negatively than, for example, the Jordanian or Qatari or Lebanese public opinion, the Algerian and the Tunisian. So it varies. I mean, is there anything else, Dr. Dana, you want to mention before we close this session?
I think you covered it.
Thank you very much for being with us. As Dr. Dana mentioned, that we have, the report and the Arab Index in brief on our website. We have our portal as well, where you can access the data and you do your own cross-tabulation throughout the years. Still the data of 2019-20, we are still uploading it. Very soon it will be on, but I mean the data of the previous years is on our portal. The contact details of Dr. Dana, our colleagues at the center, and myself are available. If you have any further questions or any clarifications, we are ready to answer. There are few small reports that is focusing on different issues that is going to be published on the coming few months in order to focus on issues that can be of interest to the people who are specialized in the Middle East or covering the Middle Eastern affairs. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Dr. Dana for this brilliant presentation.
Thanks very much, everyone.
And congratulations for the Arab Opinion Index.